Medical schools aren't picking and choosing people based on the skills they already have. They're picking and choosing people based on the traits that you have. Mission Accepted Season 2, Episode 9. 12 interviews, 10 acceptances, fighting off schools left and right. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing excellent. I'm super excited to share your story. I love when we get super successful applicants on the on Mission Accepted or on the pre-med years or wherever to really show, like, what does it take to be so successful, and what is it about your application that intrigued so many medical schools. And I think yours is going to be probably easier than a lot of others because you have a very interesting journey to where you have gotten to this point, and others will see that soon. But I want to hear from you, whether it's feedback that you've gotten through your interview circuit or just your thoughts in general. Why do you think you were so successful?
Sure. I think the one thing a lot of people are like afraid to get out of their bubble in terms of where they're applying. Like, hey, I only want to stay near family, or hey, I only know this state, or I've only ever been to this state. I'll only apply to those schools. And so I cast this like crazy wide net because I've been to a lot of places where I'm like, I'm okay with going to Florida. I can go to Texas. I can go to Arizona. Maybe I'll go back home to Missouri. But I was just okay with going to any medical school that would accept me. So I applied to a lot of them. And then actually looked at their websites and saw like, hey, does their mission kind of align with my mission? And personalized my secondaries to each medical school. So they knew that I wasn't just lying to them basically by saying, oh, I only want to go to you because you accept me.
Because according to your stats and my stats, we're a good match, and I think I have a good chance.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, exactly.
So basically what you're saying is you were authentic.
Yes.
Amazing.
And I tried to be. And a lot of times I'd convince myself, or like by reading the medical school app or their websites, that I would be okay with going there. And if I wasn't okay with going there at all, then I wouldn't apply there.
Yeah, love it. Makes sense. Makes complete sense. Although a lot of people don't do that. They just look at the MSAR, they use the sliders, find their stats, and go, okay, these are the schools I'm applying to without any other sort of research. So that's phenomenal. You applied to how many schools?
47.
Would you recommend applying to 47 schools?
I don't think you need to. At the time, I was like freaking out. I was like, oh my gosh, what if I don't get into medical school?
Yeah.
A large number of those come from Texas because you can just do the one flat rate of $200 and get all the applications.
Yeah.
And so that's what I did. If you took Texas out, I think I'd still be sitting at like 27 or something.
Yeah.
So I'd still recommend like, I don't know, 16 or above or somewhere in that higher range, but like, maybe not 47.
Yeah. 25 is the random number that I always say. It's like 25 is a lot of schools. And
that'd be good.
You probably don't need more than that. Obviously, it worked for you. And so let's go and dive into your application and find out why it works so well. So you submitted first day, 5/27/2021. We always talk about the magical kind of June 1st date for AMCAS. This last cycle, it was May 27th. The cycle before, I think it was May 28th. We had another student on a couple episodes back that also submitted May 27th, but at 9:34, I believe, a.m. Yours is at 6:31 p.m. Hers was processed the very next day. Yours, it took 10 more days or so, right?
I believe that.
So it's crazy, like just a few hours difference. And it that many people were submitting that first day. Obviously, having your application verified, processed on June 7th does not hurt you in any way compared to her being processed on May 28th. It's exactly the same because AMCAS doesn't send out the applications until the end of June anyway to medical schools.
Right.
So, great job submitting early. And just for clarification, this was your first application, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. All right, so we go through your application. We see military service marked as yes. That is going to be a big part of your application and your journey. We have here, I've mentioned this before, I like to point it out all the time. We have your parent and guardian name information anonymized here so we can't see it. But the AMCAS application automatically, based on education level, potentially occupation, will automatically create this socioeconomic status disadvantaged code. And for you, it marked it as yes. So first generation socioeconomic status code. So just something to point out. Everyone's like, where does this come from? It's just an automatic thing that AMCAS does. We see military discharge, honorable discharge. That's all great. And then we get into school. And we see, okay, we got an R. I don't know what an R is. A B, a passing grade. Some B's, a C. Oh no. And we look at the date here, 2014 to 2015. And then we have a change in college from St. Louis Community College to the Joint Services Transcript. And for anyone that doesn't know, the Joint Services Transcript is when you're in the military. That's the transcript you get for doing military classes. So talk about that transition to the military world there.
Sure.
It didn't look like you were on that path because you started at community college.
Yeah, so I initially joined the Air Force, tried to do pararescue, failed out and discharged. So that was the discharge for that. It was weird. That's what I had anticipated doing with my life. And then failing out of that, I was like, oh my goodness, what do I do now? And then I was like, wait, I still want to do medical. So what can I do that's in the medical world on the civilian side? And so I went to St. Louis Community College with the purpose of getting my EMT. I got my EMT, did prereqs for paramedic, and then eventually joined the Army. Kind of in the middle of that. Like I could have started paramedic school or I could have joined the Army, and I joined the Army. And my grades were terrible. I didn't care about GPA. I was just like, get the prereqs done so I can become a paramedic. And then I was like, I joined the Army, so I just didn't care.
Yeah.
But in the military, we do a lot of courses, even through basic training, medic training, and then any other courses like that. You get military, you can get college credit and transfer them to a college that accepts them.
Okay.
So it was Kaplan University, which is now Purdue Global University, accepted like half of my credits, which ended up being like half of my associate's degree.
Okay.
And then I just completed the rest of that online, which was awesome.
Nice. Okay. So you joined the military to be a medic, knowing that you wanted to be involved in medicine in some way, it sounds like.
Yes.
Awesome. All right. So we have your joint services transcript stuff that ultimately was given credit towards your next school, which we see here, Purdue University Global. And we see this transition to all A's. My assumption is that you potentially figured out, hey, I think I want to go to medical school, and I need to have good grades to do that. Is that the mentality switch that allowed you to get the good grades?
Yeah, so there's a program in the military called the Enlisted to Medical Degree Program, which allows me to remain enlisted in the Army and do pre-medical courses on the track to medical school. And to do that, I needed a bachelor's degree. I also needed to be competitive because I'm sure there's a bunch of people applying to it. And my GPA at the time was like really bad. And so I was like, I need to do better in all my classes. And so I did.
Yeah, it's a really great program. It was something that was rolled out when I was still active. And a really great program for people who want to go to medical school and don't really know how, that there's a path through the military to do that, which is awesome. We see George Mason University. That is the post-bac program that you're in. And again, really solid grades, doing great there as well. And we get to your GPA table. We see this freshman year, 2.43, not super solid. And then once you kind of have this transition again and recommitment to going to medical school, 396, 39 in your post-bac, 375 cumulative. So luckily that 243 was only 7 hours, so it didn't ding your GPA too much. So really solid GPA, 379 overall cumulative GPA. It's awesome. And you did really well on the MCAT, 511 on the MCAT. What do you think led to your success there?
I think a lot of people, and I don't know, a lot of people in undergrad take classes spread apart. So you'd maybe do bio, maybe do Chem 1, maybe do Chem 2 like a year after. I had to take all these courses within 1 year. And even going up to taking the MCAT, I had not finished biochemistry. I had not taken OChem 1 and 2. I was finishing physics 2. So I just self-studied I self-studied all of OChem. I self-studied quite a bit of biochem. And then all the other bio and chem and psychology was all on my own.
Okay.
which wasn't bad, but I think taking all those courses very shortly before taking the MCAT, and then also I did Blueprint.
Okay.
I did their online course, and I thought that was amazing. And
Shout
I
out to
also
Blueprint.
listened to, oh yeah, I listened to the MCAT podcast. I thought that like I had to drive a lot between class and even to the base, and I listened to the MCAT podcast like everywhere I was going.
Nice. Nice.
Yeah, so I thought that was amazing. I swear there were questions that were really close on the MCAT podcast to the MCAT that I took,
Nice. That's awesome.
or at least similar in nature.
Yeah.
So
And it's interesting, the fact that you had to self-study so much, and especially the heavier hitting biochem, OChem, it's kind of reflected with those being your lowest scores, those sciences being your lowest scores. So it's interesting to see if potentially you were able to get those courses in before, even how much higher your MCAT score could have been. But
sure.
obviously, as we mentioned at the outset, lots of interviews, lots of acceptances. Your MCAT score was good enough, as I like to say. I get lots of flack from Reddit, from Student Doctor Network. Oh, Dr. Gray tells everyone that a 511 is good enough to get you into any school. And I truly believe that, right? It's your story, it's your application that really makes the difference. A 511 probably isn't going to close doors at medical schools. It's everything else that's going to lead to that interview invite, lead to that acceptance. And again, your story definitely is intriguing and leads to lots of like, ooh, I really want to talk to this person. All right, so great job stat-wise. You course corrected, figured out, hey, this medicine thing is really cool. You have to have good grades, and I'm going to do it. And you did. You have, we get to your experiences, your activity descriptions here, and you have this tutoring job here, and kind of a basic description, nothing too special, but it makes sense because it started in March and you're applying here in May, so probably not a ton of experiences to lean on to write something super impactful, and that's okay, right? Not every activity description has to be blow it out of the water amazing. But you did a great job, just very basic, not job description-y, not salesy, just a basic, here's some impactful things. We get to Objective 0 volunteer, and again, another good story here, or your first good story here for your activity description, talking about this experience, this texting conversation that you had with a vet. I thought was really good. Obviously, these types of experiences became more common during the pandemic with like crisis text hotlines with lots of pre-meds going to those because everything else was shut down. And they're like, well, is this clinical? Is it not clinical? You put not clinical. I probably would have put clinical and let the medical schools determine because you're interacting with someone in the middle of a crisis, right? That's a patient. It just happens to be through text. But really good experience here and really, really liked it. A little sales pitchy in your conclusion with
Sure.
taught me the importance of social contact and how to be a better listener. It's kind of buried in there. Didn't make a big deal out of it. It wasn't the bulk of it, so I like the story. Blood donation screener. Again, another good story here. You don't need to go in depth into the job duties and everything else. Just really basic story of this woman coming out and passing out and just being there for her. It's awesome. Right. And again, I think the far majority of people reading these, they're normal human beings. They're potentially medical in nature, or they're research faculty reading these. They understand that people vasovagal when they're getting their blood drawn or before they're getting their blood drawn because of their nerves. People pass out. They don't need to know, like, here's what I did as a screener. They want to see the compassion and the empathy and everything else about who you are through this interaction, because guess what? People pass out when they get their blood drawn. So tell me that story. So great job. Honors, awards, recognitions. Obviously, being in the military, there's always lots of awards going around. If you're not getting awards, there's something wrong with you, because that's just like what you have to do. You get lots of awards. It's actually one of the reasons I left the military was I didn't like that game that you had to play with like OPRs and EPRs or whatever they call them in the Army.
Yeah.
I thought it was a waste of time. So, but we get this first hint here as I'm looking through this, going White House Military Office Non-Commissioned Officer of the Year. And I'm like, that's interesting. What is that? And then right below it, we get President's Medical Evaluation Treatment Unit Member of the Year. And I'm like, well, that's really interesting. I want to know more about that. And so we get this first hint, like there's some cool stuff potentially here that is going to interest me. And obviously for you, you were put in this situation, whether that's just where they PCS'd you to, whether you requested it, however you ended up in and around the White House, makes for an interesting story for you. But I want to relate that for everyone else. Follow your passions. Whether you're coaching soccer or being a science tutor or whatever else it is for you, you being yourself and then telling your story in your application is what makes it interesting. Too many of you are out there checking boxes, and the reviewers of your application are going, oh, another student who looks like every other student because they didn't try to do anything different. They didn't try to tell their story. They're just trying to show how compassionate and dedicated and hardworking they are. Like, boring. I don't want to read it. But then when you get to interesting things, and for you specifically, your interesting stuff here, at least that we've gotten to so far, is White House and President's Medical Evaluation Treatment Unit Member, whatever. Like, that's interesting. It piques my interest because I'm a normal human being that wants to be interested by things, right? So all that to say, go be yourself, people. Everyone else is already taken. All right, we get to military service. You have this enlisted to medical degree prep program, EMDPP or whatever they call it. Again, if you're in the military and you don't know about this, right? If you're a medic or an aerospace physiology person, whatever, in the Air Force, whatever, and you're thinking about medical school, you need to know about this program. So go find out some more information. So I'm glad it's here. I wouldn't have put this in your activity description.
Sure.
Because it's basically saying, hey, I did a post-bac.
Right.
Right? Why did you end up putting this here?
I think this was recommended for us to put it in there from our advisors, basically saying it was a like prestigious program. There's a lot of people that are applying to it, so you should feel happy that you applied there. There's also additional things that the post-bac program gave us, like shadowing experience, maybe research experience, things like that are maybe different than a normal post-bac program.
Okay.
Those are the reasons why I would think maybe that's why that got placed in there.
Okay. Ultimately, it doesn't hurt that it's there.
Sure.
It's just weird to me because I'm like,
yeah,
like I don't think I've ever seen anyone put like their post-bac program in the activity description. Be like, hey, I did a post-bac program. I'm like, well, duh, I see that in your transcript. So obviously a little bit different because it's through the military. But ultimately, I don't think it needs to be there. If you didn't cut out anything to put it in there, at least anything maybe important,
sure,
it obviously doesn't hurt. So we get physician shadowing, lots of shadowing, which is great. I like shadowing depending on how much you have. You could have just listed. I like seeing shadowing as a list so that I can quickly just glance at it and go, okay, ortho, derm, pain management, radiology, dermatology, whatever, and just see kind of the date range and all the different specialties versus trying to pick it out of a paragraph. Because for me, especially with as much shadowing as you have, like I know shadowing is super passive, not super sexy. You probably didn't get a ton out of it, so what you write about it probably isn't going to be super like inspiring or eye-opening. So just show me who you shadowed. Now, if you've only shadowed one doctor, then sure, maybe go into a little bit more depth because there's like having one thing listed there is a little sparse, but that's the games that we play with the activity descriptions. Great job with the research. Obviously, being in the military, having that exposure as a medic made it a lot easier for you to get that exposure. We get to research. you're at Walter Reed, you're doing COVID research for a few months, and that's great. So you're in there working on the vaccine. How did you get involved with vaccine research when you're a medic and trying to go to medical school? Is this an opportunity that just presented itself, or did you put yourself out there to say, hey, like, I want to go to medical school, research is important? Did you talk to your commander and go, hey, like, put me somewhere?
So with COVID, we were working a little bit less just because they wanted less people in space so we don't get each other sick and stuff.
Yeah.
So I was having a little bit more time off.
You mean the military was logical about that?
They were, and I loved it. It was good for a little bit there, and then we got busy again. I was surprised, but I was also like, hey, what are gaps in my application? And I don't mean to be like a checklist person, but I was like, what could I actually do with my time off?
Yep.
And so I reached out to some of the doctors that I worked with. I was like, hey, I know you work with a lot of people. Is there anybody that you know that would be interested in having somebody do research with them? And so they had reached out to somebody at Walter Reed, and that's how I kind of got connected with that.
Love it. Love it. Cool. All right. So some research there, which is great. And then we get to the ones that I think piqued some interest. And we have it redacted here. We can't see it. Obviously, the medical school admissions committee members, the reviewers, could see what you wrote about. A little too sensitive to share on YouTube with everyone. But we see White House Combat Medic Specialist. 5,000 hours, so full-time job. This is where you were stationed from 2018 to 2020. And all I do as a reviewer is go, that's pretty badass. Like, that's cool. Now, I don't know what you wrote about. Maybe you just were checking people in, like, doing nothing. But my assumption is it was a pretty cool gig. I've known White House physicians. It's a pretty cool gig. And so this activity, and why I kept talking about like your specific story, being in the military, where you were stationed, that's just very intriguing, right? And lots of students are going to watch this and go, well, I'm not in the military, or I was, but I was never stationed at the White House, so I'm a nobody, I can't do it. And that's where I keep going back to, you go be yourself, right? You can't be this person who we're talking to right now. He's already taken. You go be yourself. And go highlight the things that you think are interesting to yourself without trying to conform to, oh, well, if I just was a White House combat medic specialist, then I could get into medical school too. And that's not what got you in. Maybe that opened doors for interviews, but ultimately it's your story, why you want to be a physician, your stats, your interview abilities that ultimately got you as many acceptances as you've gotten so far. Would you agree?
I agree. I like it.
With that said, my assumption is that all of your interviewers wanted to talk about your time at the White House.
They did. It was funny because I got like half and half. So half of them were like, hey, don't tell me about it. I don't want to know.
Okay.
And then because they assume that there's like some sensitive nature that I couldn't talk about what I did.
They assume like when you got on the call with me, I'm like, I'm scared to talk to you. The Secret Service is going to come knocking at my door.
Yeah. Usually it's less ominous than that. And then the other half were like, hey, what does that actually mean? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah.
And so then most of the time I would talk about it anyway. It comes up when they start asking questions about clinical things or stories.
Yeah.
And then you could be like, hey, that one time at work, this is what I did. And they're like, wait, the White House? White House? They're like, okay. So
yeah, it's interesting, right? It sounds super sexy, and it is. It's cool, right? Because it's the White House, it's the home of the president, whatever. But at the end of the day, it's a medical clinic. It just happens to be at a cool place.
Right.
You're taking care of patients, just in a really cool location. So, and obviously it comes with some potential other opportunities that we'll get to in your personal statement, some other stories that it's like, oh, that's really cool that you were able to do that, right? Very similar to me, like if I were to talk about my flight surgeon experience of like I got to fly an F-16, right? Being in this position allows you to have some cool experiences that you can then carry forward and talk about for the rest of your life, which is awesome. All right, so lots of time there. Military medical training, obviously the military, you do lots of training, so you have that on here. You're a CrossFit coach, so you have hobby on here, which is awesome. I love hobbies on an application, so that's great. You have the leadership here, military leadership, President's Medical Evaluation Treatment Unit. Really impactful statement here. I led a 62-person military medical team that was responsible for the medical care of the first and second families, right? That alone, I'm like, you are badass. 62-person military medical team, like, I have lots of faith in you. Without you needing to sell, I'm a strong leader, a competent leader, a good communicator, a good organizer. Just the fact that one sentence was like, okay, you can handle your stuff, right? Which is great. So, awesome. You have more stuff here that's redacted. Again, kind of your full-time gig before the other gig that was redacted. President's Medical Evaluation Treatment Team. Done. Like, I want more. Like, I'm really intrigued. Maybe you can send it to me separately, and
Sure.
we won't display it. So those experiences, great. Obviously, the school saw those, and they're very intrigued by those. And just again, with your story, your presentation, you're not overly selling yourself. You're like, just this is who I am. I was afforded these responsibilities, which ultimately show that I'm capable. But remember. And again, I want to make sure I'm not overly selling the fact that if we scroll back up to I led a 62-person military medical team, it's not the fact that you led a 62-person military medical team. The medical schools aren't looking at you and going, oh, this person already knows how to do X and this person already knows how to do Y. Medical schools aren't picking and choosing people based on the skills they already have. They're picking and choosing people based on the traits that you have. And the traits that you have based on leading this team tells me a ton about you. I'll teach you all the skills you need to know. You may need to unlearn some things that you know as a medic to be a good physician, and that's okay. We'll unlearn those for you. And you'll relearn them to be a physician, at least the way that our medical school wants you to know how to do these things. So again, I don't want students to look at this and go, well, I'm hopeless because I don't have those skills. It's not the skills that I'm focused on here. It's the traits. You, watching this, as a soccer coach, can demonstrate the same traits. I keep wanting to say skills, the same traits as the student here who led a 62-person military medical team. All right, you just lead a 12-person, 15-person soccer team. Same traits. Leadership, organization, communication, same traits. We get to your Walter Reed Army medic before all the sexy stuff at the White House and President's team. And this one, you kind of like got lazy with this one, I think, because it just seems like a list of job duties. You're like, whatever. This was not that important. What happened here?
So when I was making my 3 most memorable, I actually made 4 because I was like, let me write all these things and then see what kind of fits what I'm hoping that admissions want to see,
okay,
/ what I want to tell them.
Yep.
And so I had made a big, long story for this and then forgot that I'd put that in my personal statement. And I was like, oh, wait, I can't put this in the activities. It's going to be like double dipping.
Okay.
And so I just was like, there's not a whole lot I can say. I guess I could have reworked it and done something different. I saw a lot of patients and there's a lot of stories to tell. But with the character amount that we had, there wasn't a lot that I could say.
Yeah. And again, I think I mentioned at the beginning, not everyone has to be super sexy, go into super detailed stories. So yeah, that's okay, right? It works. We get to your paid medical EMT experience or emergency room technician experience. And again, a little bit job duty wise at the top, and then good story for the bottom. A little minor typo in this one, with just an extra period that got carried over somehow. Again, not the end of the world. Lots of students will see this after they submit and they go, oh my gosh, my chances are done. I'll never get into medical school. All right. Typos happen. That's okay. And then we have your lifeguard experience. And I wanted to bring this up because it looks like this is from high school.
It was weird because it was high school, and so I almost omitted it, but there was more like after I graduated and left the Air Force and came back.
Okay.
I came back to doing lifeguarding before I became an EMT. So I kept it in there because I still did supervisoring and like lifeguard instructing and all those things.
Okay. So carried over post graduation for high school.
Correct.
And that's generally the rule of thumb that we'll give is things that happen in high school, stay off the application. If it happened in high school and after high school, then sure, go ahead and put it in. So I just wanted to clarify that. So that's great. All right. Any questions, thoughts about experience descriptions? Any tips on how you did so well with the storytelling here?
Sure. Actually, a lot of it was by watching your videos when you're like, hey, tell a story. And a lot of times I would write down like, what story am I trying to tell? And so I just would write down a Word document and say, hey, these are the things that I saw. And then I was like, well, what can I actually say that I did that was important or that somebody might read and say, hey, this went well.
Yeah.
And then I wrote those stories.
Yeah. And that's perfect. Because at the end of the day, the stories are what connect humans. And so it's very intriguing to read and to see you in those situations versus, oh, you think you're hardworking and compassionate and driven and blah, 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 which is where most students go with those things. Talk about writing the personal statement versus writing the activity descriptions. Which one do you think was harder?
Personal statement was harder.
Really?
Because I think it's easier when you're just writing about one thing to not go off on all these little tangents and like stuff that doesn't matter or actually being short with what you're saying. Because you only have 5,000 characters. And I've done a lot of things in the last like 6 years that I could talk about.
Yeah.
But I can't talk about all of them.
Yeah.
And so being short and then like limiting you is actually good, I think, because it forces you to be very direct in what you're meaning and what you're saying.
Yeah. Got it. Perfect. All right. We get to the personal statement. And here's where things get very interesting. Now, we can see a little bit of your job duties as part of this kind of White House team. Is like our motorcade drove quickly through the streets of India, passing crowds of people excited to see a state visit from the United States. Right? I love showing through writing. Right? Showing, not telling. Very basic writing 101. Description, and this is a perfect start to showing the reader what's going on. I think we all can picture the president's motorcade or whoever's motorcade driving through the streets with police cars on all sides and some lead cars and back cars and all the important people squished somewhere in the middle. And so I read this and go, ooh, this is really interesting. It's like starting off as like a John Clancy or whatever his name is novel, like, ooh, Jack Ryan, here we go. And so we have a very nice hook. Now, I'm guessing you did this on purpose to start with the story because you figured it would be a nice little hook to lead people to be interested.
Yeah. So I was like looking at this and I was like, how do I want to actually start this? Because what I wanted to say was like, hey, I wanted to be more. Like I enjoy being a medic, but I wanted to be a doctor. And so a lot, like I spent the whole personal statement saying that. But I was like, in what like place am I actually having something to like bring you in instead of starting off this like dry, like telling my story all the way from when I was like 18 or 19. Like, I don't think they want to hear this like huge life story.
Yep.
I was like, how can I bring you into where I'm at now?
Yep.
And so that's kind of how I did that.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. So we have a nice little hook, and then we do get a little timeliney. We have a little story working at Six Flags and what that looked like and kind of your first patient at Six Flags with this woman passing out. And then again, a little timeliney of like, well, I jumped here, I jumped here, I jumped here. For non-traditional students, sometimes you have to do that just to give some context about your whole journey. And ultimately, you get to your next statement here of your first duty station as an Army medic, Walter Reed National Medical Center. You have this patient. You tried to get into a story here, and I think you missed a little bit with this story because it was almost all about the patient and nothing about you, I think. And you finished with a decent conclusion of seeing his improvement over time reinforced your desire to reduce the suffering of others through medicine. So nice, strong conclusion there, but I would have loved to see the interaction of you with that patient versus just reading about the patient. So that could have been even bigger. And then a conclusion, again, not the strongest conclusion. I love big picture conclusions. I talk about it all the time. I get very repetitive with like big picture, aspirational, what do you hope to accomplish? And you get a little salesy of like, well, being an Army medic has enhanced my ability to be creative and resourceful when traditional assets are unavailable. So little sales pitchy with skills and what you've learned. But ultimately, obviously, it worked for you. I like to say sometimes people get in despite their medical their personal statement, and that's okay. Or some people might have really liked your personal statement despite what I'm saying because I don't know anything. Or rather, I can't speak for every single person reviewing an application. So, decent personal statement. Really hooked with that beginning though. So it doesn't really matter what the rest said because that opening really, I was like, oh, this is really interesting. I want to talk to you. But at the end of the day, I understand your journey, which I think is the most important part of the personal statement. Even if you don't follow Dr. Gray's method to a T, I understand why you're doing this. I understand the journey that led you here. And that's the most important part of the personal statement. And then we get to your school list and lots of public schools. Talk about your school list choice. We talked earlier about the number of schools that you applied to.
Sure.
Obviously, with Texas being easy to apply to all of them, that's a big chunk of them. You did apply to DO schools as well. Talk about, at least for the school list that we see here, what was your thought process in picking schools?
Sure. So some of it was like I applied to USIS because that's right next door. That would be the active duty med school.
Yep.
I applied to all the Missouri schools because that's where my family lives.
Yep.
Everywhere else was kind of like, if I looked at their school and I kind of liked what they did,
Yep.
that's what I picked. I was familiar with the Midwest, so I picked a couple of those schools, which is interesting because they are public schools, and I did see some out-of-state people going there. But a lot of them were like, hey, if you're not an in-state resident or you don't have really strong ties, like don't even do the secondary.
Yep.
And so I got straight rejected from, I think, 3 of them,
Okay.
of the public schools. I did try to keep some of them, like University of Arizona Phoenix they're either public and accept like half out of state.
Yep.
And I got into there, so I was really happy because when I looked on MSAR, they actually had half and half.
Yeah, it's weird. The Tucson and Phoenix campuses are very different with their out-of-state, in-state percentages.
They are, and I'm interview waitlisted at Tucson because I applied there as well. Okay. So it's interesting to see the change. I think you can still apply to public schools, but like I looked at MSAR to be like, do you guys only accept like 10 out of state? Because then I don't really want to apply to you.
Yeah, and that's my biggest takeaway that I want students to have. When I point out like, ooh, that's lots of public schools, I'm not saying don't apply to public schools. I'm saying understand what it means to apply to public out-of-state schools as a non-resident. Look at the MSAR. It's one of the good reasons to have the MSAR is to look at how many out-of-state applicants are applying to these public schools, how many are applying, how many are interviewed, how many are accepted. They may say they accept out-of-state students, but when you actually look at the numbers, they really don't. And so I just want students to understand that there are ramifications in applying to public out-of-state schools. That's why I harp on it so much, because so many students don't understand that. So as long as, right, we talk about in medicine, and you as a medic, you know, right, we talk about informed consent. If I'm going to do something to you as a patient, then I need you to understand the benefits and the risks and what could happen. It's the same thing that I try to harp on here, is I just need you to be informed that applying to public out-of-state schools could, for a lot of people, for a lot of schools, be a complete waste of money. They just aren't going to give you the time of day. I just need you to know that, and if you still choose to apply, great, make that donation. So, you obviously, again, super successful with the application cycle, telling your story as we saw throughout your application. If we compare your application to many applications on application renovation, And most of the mission accepted applications to application renovation, the biggest difference for me isn't stats, right? You have decent stats, but I've had stats on application renovation, 4.0, 521 MCAT, students not getting in. And it's not because they weren't military White House medics. It's because their application, the story that they told, was non-existent, and they're just trying to go, hey, look at how awesome I am. I'm like you and everyone else, right? And so you did a great job telling your story, not overly trying to sell yourself. Just here's who I am. Here are the experiences I've had. Yes, they are very interesting experiences that a lot of people are intrigued about. And so that definitely helped you. But again, you watching can have very similar intriguing experiences that don't involve working at the White House. So I want everyone to take away from this that you just need to go live your life, tell your story in your application, and know that at the end of the day, it's a human being reading your application, and you just need to connect with them through your writing so they understand who you are and they want to talk to you at the end of the day. Talk about the interview prep. Obviously, lots of interviews. Can get very intimidating after a while, though I'm sure after the first few, you're like, oh, whatever, I don't need to prep anymore. I got this. How did you prepare for those first few interviews?
Sure. So basic preparation, I was like, I need to answer at least two questions. Like, why do you want to be a doctor? And tell me about yourself.
Yep.
And so I prepped myself with those two questions and had very good answers. I didn't want to stay scripted, but like I also wanted to hit key points.
Yep.
But for the actual schools, a couple days before my interview was going to be, I would Google their site and look at their curriculum and be like, what do I like about their curriculum? Mm-hmm. I would Google their, when do they take step one? Because that's important to me. When do you get clinical experience? Like, is it early? And then that's important to me as well. And then how is your facilities? Maybe doesn't matter as much. And then I'd write all those things down and pick three out of all the things that I wrote down. Because sometimes they'll ask, like, hey, why this school? And a lot of times they could be like, well, I love your anatomy program. You guys use cadavers, blah, blah, blah. Or something that was unique to the school. Because I think a lot of people can say a lot of things about one medical school, and you could apply that to like all the medical schools. Yeah. And so I would pick all the unique programs that they had that I kind of liked and would talk to them about it. And some interviewers were surprised. They're like, oh, wow, you actually did research for our school. And I was
Is
like,
that surprising? Like, you
I was
shouldn't
like,
be
well,
that
I'm
surprised.
trying to go to medical school. Yeah. It shouldn't be surprising, but I know there's a lot of people that don't do that. So do your research before doing your interviews, please.
Do your research and don't just list, well, you have this, well, you have this, well, you have this. It's like, you have this thing and it's interesting to me because blah, blah, blah. All right. Too many students just list things that they read, or they just are very generic of like, well, I'm really impressed with your dedication to making good doctors. I'm like, okay, thank you for that. So talk to me about the success that you had. It's not super common that students get 10 acceptances or more to medical school. Number one, is it boring now to get another call or another email of like, hey, you've been accepted? You're like, okay, great, another deposit I have to put down. Is it boring? And how are you going to ultimately choose where to go?
Yeah, so it's not too boring right now, but I get a lot more selective. So when I didn't have my first acceptance, I was like, I'm taking every interview you give me, because I don't know that even if I do 10 interviews, I may not get accepted. So I took every single interview until I got my first acceptance.
Nice.
And then after that, I was like, well, I can get a lot more selective. Because if I'm accepted to a school that I'd rather go to than one that I'd be less okay with going to, then so that's kind of how I did that. And then I looked at like what is important to the school. Most of the interviews were virtual, but I did have one in person. And for me, that's clinical and research and like a lot of clinical care. Some have like, hey, we're interested in public health. Yeah. Hey, we're interested in rural care.
Yeah.
Was
it the Arizona interview that was in person?
Yep, yeah, exactly.
I don't know why they're doing in person, but yeah.
I don't know either. I enjoyed it. I think it was nice. Yeah. Anyway. But yeah, so for me, Arizona's probably top of my list right now, next to maybe St. Louis University.
So
and then I won't hear back from them.
That's interesting. Do you think they're top of your list because you actually got to go?
Yeah, see, that's what I don't know. It's hard because it was nice to see the facilities. It was nice to see the people. I got to interact with the students like 4 times to actually talk to them and be like, hey, back of the door, what is it actually like to go here? I know I'm getting a
Yeah.
lot of stuff from the admissions committee, but what is it actually like?
Tell me
And
the dirt.
yeah, and it was nice to hear from them because they weren't pulling their hair out. They're like, it's stressful, but we still have fun on the weekends and we still hang out. Like, so it was good to hear from the student body.
Yeah.
So it's maybe I am biased because it was in person.
Yeah, and that's okay. And it's good to recognize that too, right? It's good to recognize as you're making your pros and cons list, like you may have Arizona at the top of your list, but you have to really go, is this because I was there? And let me really, really dig in to that number 2 school on my list and maybe make a trip there before I make my ultimate decision.
And that's what I'm doing. I'm actually taking a trip to St. Louis University in January.
See?
They have like a second look, and I'm going to do that. And then I won't hear back from Mayo Clinic until February as well.
Okay.
So
awesome.
A couple things lined up, I guess.
Perfect. You're on the right track. You're a smart dude. So, well, congratulations on all of your success. Thank you for your service. I would love to have a drink with you sometime and hear all of the fun White House stories,
Sure.
especially with who was in office at that time, because I'm sure that made it that much more fun. But obviously, again, you told your story well. I understand why you're doing this. You have the stats to back it up. And ultimately you intrigued enough people out there to get those interviews and to get those acceptances. So thank you for coming on and sharing your story. And congratulations on all your success now and hopefully in the future as well.
Thank you.